Good evening. I am David Traub, co-founder of Save Our Sites, with a warm welcome to another Save Our Sites lecture event, this time for obvious reasons on Zoom. Thank you so much for coming. We apologize for being absent for a period, but now we are up and running on Zoom and will continue to be in that way as necessary. This evening, we are offering a lecture by Dr. David Breiner of Thomas Jefferson University. But before I introduce him, I want to take pleasure in announcing the Save Our Sites 2020 Annual Award for Service to the Philadelphia Preservation Community. In past years, the award has been given to John Webster, Joseph Minardi, Oscar Beiser, and Jim Duffin. This year, we are giving it to Dr. Stephen J. Peitzman. Dr. Peitzman is a practicing physician and faculty member at Drexel University College of Medicine. He is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and Temple University, where he received his MD. While continuing to pursue his doctorate, Steve has skillfully turned his attention from the human body to the great architectural body of Philadelphia, and has successfully nominated for designation several buildings in the East Falls neighborhood of Philadelphia, where he lives. Just as important, he generously supports the nomination of designations by other people at hearings at the Historical Commission. He faithfully attends these monthly meetings of the Commission and its designation committee and offers informed comments on designation and other matters relating to the complexities of preservation. The Commission is where the action is, where crucial decisions relating to preservation are made, and Steve is consistently there on the front line. He is indeed the model preservationist. We only wish that there were more like him. Steve, I virtually present this certificate to you, and be assured it will be placed in your actual hands at a future occasion. Congratulations, Steve. Now it is my delight to introduce Dr. David M. Breiner, a graduate of Notre Dame University, where he studied architecture, and Cornell University, receiving there a doctorate in architectural history. Good evening, David. In the recent past, he served on the staff of the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission. Professor Breiner is now the Associate Dean of Architecture in the Built Environment at Thomas Jefferson University. David as well teaches courses in historic preservation and conducts theory seminars in American and Vernacular Architecture. He is currently president of the Philadelphia chapter of the Society of Architectural Historians. We welcome David to our event without further ado. David?
Thank you for that introduction, David. And I will share my screen, make sure everything is working. I also want to thank my audience for their interest in this topic and offer my congratulations to Dr. Peitzman on his well-deserved award. I've been teaching courses in architectural history and theory in East Falls at Thomas Jefferson University since 1995, and more recently, courses in archival research for historic preservation. During that time, changing attitudes toward education in general, as well as my own observations, have encouraged me to transform my courses to emphasize student projects that involve real-world and, when possible, interdisciplinary experiences. In addition, I attempt to choose sites in the community that local organizations are interested in, or that at least seem to have promise of providing an interesting story to add to local history. This has manifested itself in students documenting the history of nearby buildings so they can enjoy the benefits of visiting the site and using local libraries and archives to supplement their online research, seen on the left, which of course is how they would normally approach this. When possible, each project includes a report out to the community, as seen on the right. Some structures are real architectural treasures. Some have largely historic or cultural value, and some are interesting from multiple points of view, such as these examples. In this talk, I will share with you some of the results. My students and I have worked on sites as far north as Plymouth Meeting and as far west as Newtown Square. As rewarding as those projects were, students spent a lot of time traveling back and forth to campus. Therefore, most of the assignments have been closer to campus, particularly in East Falls and Germantown. I apologize in advance for omitting Mount Airy, Chestnut Hill, Manayunk, Roxborough, and the other neighborhoods that comprise the rest of Northwest Philadelphia. Those would provide good material for talk on another day. Also, some sites I will show are on the National Register or the Philadelphia Register of Historic Places. I've included them with the expectation that some people in the audience may be less familiar with our neck of the woods. However, I will limit my discussion of those better known places since this talk is supposed to be about hidden gems. So here we are on the right, looking eastward on Shelton Avenue in a 1930s photo, getting ready to explore what jewels survive buried in the palimpsest of Northwest Philadelphia. East Falls, historically known as Falls of Schuylkill, developed as a village along the river, where it maintains much of its historic character. As industry brought employment opportunities, the streets, mostly west of today's Henry Avenue, filled up with the modest row houses that characterize many Philadelphia neighborhoods. By the early 20th century, changes in transportation and demands for middle-class housing spurred other lots, mostly east of Henry Avenue, to be built up with freestanding houses. But throughout the neighborhood, most streets maintained their consistent texture and scale, and buildings both stand out as landmarks and represent the social and cultural activities of past generations. Several years ago, while serving on the board of the East Falls Historical Society, I began a survey of the neighborhood's architectural resources, an activity which was embedded in some of my courses. Due to the nature of those courses, sometimes the students' efforts were limited to, on the left, photography and a condition survey taken from the sidewalk, and, on the right, enough census research to determine the dwelling's earliest inhabitants. Here we see census records for Henry Avenue and Ainsley Street addresses. We have completed about 40% of the neighborhood to date, and community members have attended end of the semester meetings when students reported their findings. Due to the pandemic, this effort is on hiatus. Some semesters, students have conducted more intense research on individual structures, which is what I'll emphasize today. For projects in my American Architecture and Vernacular Architecture seminars, students have typically had 7 weeks, during which time they conducted online research, including the Philadelphia Architects and Buildings Database and Geohistory Network Database, the Historic American Buildings Survey, and phillyhistory.org. In addition, those students have visited the sites for documentation and had some time to visit local libraries for additional work. A few of the projects, as seen here, done in my archival research class, now called Uncovering the Past, were very thorough, lasting the full semester. Therefore, for each site, they added building permit searches, development of a chain of title, and coordinated searches for historic photos, biographical info, oral histories, and other resources. Students consulted local repositories, such as the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, the Free Library's print and photo collection and Historic Atlas collection, the Germantown Historical Society's Pat Henning Library and Archives, and the collections of the East Falls Historical Society. This expectation will pose a challenge for the upcoming spring semester, though several of our partners seem to be willing to explore remote alternatives. Let's start with a building we should all know about due to its architectural and historical significance. Castle Ringstedten, a club for the Undine Barge Club on Ridge Avenue, which is on the Philadelphia Register of Historic Places. The rowing club had been founded in 1856 to provide businessmen with both socialization and exercise through a sport then recently introduced to Philadelphia. The Schuylkill River, which the city had recently protected with the establishment of Fairmount Park, was an excellent course for the athletes. This location, a 2-acre site 3 miles upriver from the club's boathouse, was a suitable goal for the athletes and provided a social respite. The club's unusual name, Castle Ringstedten, came from the legendary castle in the German fairy tale of Undine, a water spirit. The group commissioned Frank Furness and partner George Hewitt to design the structure in 1875, and it is a fine example of Furness's innovative architectural ideas, including using the exposed timber members in the dormer to suggest the frame construction hidden within the walls. The appealing wraparound porch, hipped roof, and bold forms were detailed with carefully considered colors, textures, and angular repetitive patterns characteristic of his work. On the interior, dolphins in the wainscoting trim refer to the natural riverine setting. The building retains its historic use of housing regular dinners and special events. Architectural historians are familiar with the Northwest's nationally famous Church of St. James the Less, but there are other religious buildings which are less known. Lutheran services in German were begun in 1898 at the Old Academy, and 2 years later, a small congregation was formed to worship, and worship was switched to English. Originally called the Evangelical Lutheran Church of the Redeemer, and later Redeemer Lutheran Church, this structure on Midvale Avenue was built during the pastorate of Reverend Henry F. Hale. It was designed by Germantown architect Davis E. Suppley. He started his career as a carpenter and later identified himself as an architect, builder, and contractor as well. Suppley was also commissioned by the city as the sole architect and construction supervisor for all police stations. Among his other projects, he designed the Central Congregation Church at 18th and Green Streets, the Crescent Barge Club on Boathouse Row, the now demolished Ridge Avenue Farmers Market, and low-cost housing. Later in his career, he did the East Falls Church, which was built in 1909 by Herman Voigt of North 28th Street, using local Chestnut Hill stone, otherwise known as Wissahickon schist, and galvanized iron cornices, and costing about $15,000. Less than 10 years later, the interior was destroyed by fire and rebuilt. With its pared down neo-Gothic character, it was a great example of the kinds of churches built in the early 20th century in Philadelphia's neighborhoods for many mainline Protestant congregations. A century later, demographic trends have reduced the demand for such buildings. In this case, it led to portions of the building, including the stained glass, being relocated and the structure converted into condos just a few years ago. Diagonally across Midvale Avenue stands a hub of the East Falls community, the Falls of Schuylkill Library, listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Using the historic name of the neighborhood, this library building was one of hundreds funded by philanthropist Andrew Carnegie and built between 1886 and 1917 to provide free, accessible service to all, under the oversight of Carnegie's secretary, James Bertram. It was one of 20 extant Carnegie-funded branch libraries built in Philadelphia. This site was donated by two Schoolhouse Lane neighbors, oil and shipping magnate William J. Warden and foundry owner and sugar refiner William H. Merrick. Another neo-Gothic, alternately called Tudor Gothic design, clad in stone, the exterior of this building, as seen on the left, with its buttressed walls and tracery windows, crenellated parapet, and slender lantern capping the slate-covered roof, was more highly decorated than its neighbor across the street. Since steel beams supported the peaked roof, the interior could have an open layout for the main story seen on the right, guaranteeing efficient management by one librarian at the central circulation desk. Such practical considerations were standard in Philadelphia's Carnegie libraries. Other activity spaces were located below in the raised basement. This building, erected in 1912 to 13 and costing about $35,000, was the work of Rankin, Kellogg, and Crane, a prolific firm which designed federal projects in Indianapolis, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and Philadelphia, the latter being the U.S. Marine Corps building, as well as a wide variety of building types on the East Coast, in Cincinnati, New Orleans, and other locations in California. For the next item, I must acknowledge Dr. Peitzman because he provided the student researcher with helpful guidance. The Women's Medical College, later the Falls Center on Henry Avenue and listed on the National Register in 2008, has national significance. Founded in Center City by progressive Quakers in 1850, as the Female Medical College of Pennsylvania, it was the world's first medical school for women and had a large impact on women's educational opportunities and their standing in U.S. society. This building, dating from 1925, on the new East Falls campus, was by Ritter and Shea. The firm was known for their monumental Packard building and speculative high-rises in Center City, but also for their colonial revival design for the National Society of the Colonial Dames of America. The new medical school building was also in the colonial revival style of red brick trimmed in stone and a symmetrical facade highlighting the colossal stone portico. The style, particularly in its more austere form, with detailing concentrated around the central entrance, as shown in the detail at the lower right, was popular for institutional architecture of the era. This design in particular was celebrated for its rational plan. For the first purpose-built hospital in the nation, with teaching and hospital care united, the arrangement appropriately assigned offices and classrooms to one wing and wards and labs to the other wing. Meanwhile, pediatrics was conveniently located near the entrance, and the operating suite was a self-contained unit in a more remote location. Overall layout features, such as maximizing south-facing windows and natural ventilation, reflected modern hygienic and efficient principles in 1920s hospital design. Despite these features, the building's functions were consolidated elsewhere, and in the last few years, it was renovated into the Preston luxury apartments. And modern architecture is no stranger to East Falls. In addition to the many mid-century modern houses tucked away on wooded sites near the Wissahickon Creek, there is also the very visible Engine 35 Ladder 25 on Ridge Avenue. Engine 35 was organized at a site further down the avenue, but moved into a new structure on this site in 1896. That building was demolished in 1958 and replaced by a station to accommodate Engine 35 as well as Ladder 25, both of which continue to serve the neighborhood. The incorporation of modern flat-roofed volumes of concrete and steel, asymmetrical composition, and unadorned masonry surfaces proclaimed the modern efficiency of 1950s firefighting methods. The projecting volume on the left was sheathed in beige stone arranged in a random ashlar pattern, while the polished stone framed the roll-up door. The recessed volume on the right continued the beige stone as a base beneath beige brick punctured by a ribbon window. The architects, Supowitz and Demchik, were also responsible for schools, housing, and other fire stations in Greater Philadelphia. Earlier in his career, David Supowitz had designed a large number of theaters and residential projects. Israel Demchik, a Russian immigrant and Stewardson Competition Fellow, studied under renowned architect Paul Cray and worked for prominent architects Edmund Gilchrist and the firm of Rankin, Kellogg, and Crane. In addition to fire stations, he designed many restaurants, private dwellings, apartment buildings, and other building types. Now it's time for an interesting cautionary tale. Falls of Schuylkill, later East Falls Baptist Church, the oldest church in the area, was at one time a monumental presence on Indian Queen Lane. The congregation, founded in 1838 for working men and their families, met at the old academy before erecting its church and lecture room in 1851 to 52. The committee overseeing the construction consisted of James Morrison, Benjamin Marley, and Charles F. Abbott, the last of whom lived in a mansion still standing 2 doors down the street. Over the years, church members went on significant missionary trips to India, China, and the Philippines. In terms of the Romanesque revival architecture, which recalled medieval European traditions, the most notable elements were the elaborately carved concentric arches of the entrance portal and the graceful multi-tiered steeple with its tall spire. Sadly, then, though the building survives and still functions as a church, over time the exterior was refaced. A simpler applied arch and rose window replaced the original carved entrance. The tall steeple was truncated and the spire removed. So I'm glad to depart East Falls on a more uplifting architectural note and a reflection of the neighborhood's sometime nickname of Kellyville. In 2016, for my archival research course, the students devoted the entire semester to documenting the history and significance of the Kelly House on Henry Avenue. The prominent, slightly raised lot overlooked newly built Henry Avenue at a gentle curve. The house and its detached garage were designed in 1925 by Edward F. Hoffman. Hoffman was educated at the William Penn Charter School just around the corner and the University of Pennsylvania, and worked for Frank Furness and Horace Trumbauer, among other mentors. He primarily designed residential projects, but also did the University of Pennsylvania's College Boat Club on Boathouse Row. The house was built by its clients, John B. Kelly and Margaret Major Kelly. Mrs. Kelly was the first female swimming coach for co-eds at the University of Pennsylvania. She also coached at the Women's Medical College, an institution she actively supported. Husband Jack Kelly, a former Olympic rower and owner of a successful building firm, would later become a leader in Democratic politics. He was a nearly successful candidate for mayor and served on several local and national boards. His rise to social acceptance and economic success inspired other Irish Americans in Philadelphia whose ancestors had arrived and fought against the limits of the status quo. The house he built for his family was carefully crafted in the colonial revival style, using English bond brickwork, ranging in color from red to beige to brown, and trimmed in wood. The brickwork not only was closely associated with the style, but represented Jack's business. The symmetrically articulated core of the house was capped by a slate-covered gabled roof and was flanked by side wings and a rear kitchen extension. The focal point of the front was the handsome portico of fluted columns. In 2016, the owner, perhaps thanks to the gentle persuasion of the East Falls Historical Society, permitted us access to the house's interior in order for the students to produce measured plans, one of which is seen on the left. The interior had a spacious central hall plan with, on the first floor, living room and sun porch on the right, and dining room, kitchen, and pantry to the left. Jack Kelly, owner, occupant, and builder of the stately residence, was the patriarch of a family which included, of course, daughter Grace Kelly. Actress and style icon, Grace attended the nearby Academy of the Assumption at Ravenhill, a building on the city register, and became engaged to wed Prince Rainier of Monaco at this address. In addition, Jack's son, John B. Kelly Jr., or Kell, was also an Olympic rower as well as a leader in athletic organizations and a city councilman. The extended Kelly family is among the best known in Philadelphia, but the house may be overlooked by people who speed by on Henry Avenue, which is a shame. Next door to East Falls is Germantown, a neighborhood famous for its colonial and Victorian dwellings. But there is much more to discover if one bothers to look. Before World War II, it was a prosperous community, constantly building and rebuilding. The 1930 photo on the left reminds us of that era, in which West Shelton Avenue was home to many upscale commercial ventures, especially auto dealerships. However, today the vicinity faces challenges common to many urban neighborhoods. That is why the Edmund N. Bacon Urban Design Awards student competition selected Shelton Avenue in 2019 to 2020 as the site for a possible urban design intervention. One of Jefferson's landscape architecture studios entered the competition, looking for ways to help the neighborhood take better advantage of its assets. Therefore, in order to link my own archival research class to their effort, I selected sites along West Shelton that seemed to have lasting value and encouraged the students to choose among them for in-depth research projects. Some of the buildings we had hoped would have significance turned out less than successful, mostly due to lack of documentation. But here are a few that confirmed Germantown's treasure chest of hidden gems. Following the Civil War, Germantown grew substantially, and West Shelton Avenue became lined with gracious suburban homes, many of them twin dwellings, such as these on the left. Numbers 410 and 412 West Shelton Avenue typified the 2.5-story Second Empire style houses found in Philadelphia neighborhoods developed during the 1870s. Built of local stone laid in random patterns, they sported the mansard roof, projecting bays, and decorative window surrounds associated with the style. Lack of historic documentation about the porches left us puzzled as to their exact history, since the sunburst motif in the triangular pediments over the stairs is associated with the slightly later Queen Anne revival movement. Nevertheless, we learned a lot about the building's social history. The owner of the two lots when the houses were built was dry goods wholesaler and real estate man Edward Addicks, a financier of the gasworks and unsuccessful US Senate contender. And the student researcher was able to trace most of the later owners and occupants. Eventually, the neighborhood's increasing urbanization in the 20th century led to denser residential development, as seen on the right. Apartment buildings such as the Delmar Morris apartments were erected on some sites near the western end of the street. This property, now on the National Register and therefore not so hidden, was owned by influential railroad magnate and developer Henry H. Houston, who was also responsible for the large Wissahickon Heights project in Chestnut Hill. Built in 1902, the Delmar Apartments was one of the earliest examples of apartment construction outside downtown and its adjacent neighborhoods, predating the expansive Alden Park Apartments just a few blocks to the west. Local architect and developer Frederick Fox provided a design that would appeal to the middle class, a sober colonial revival building with a wraparound porch at the entrance and bay windows allowing maximum natural light and ventilation into the units. Nearby, a real hidden gem survives, another testament to Germantown's increasing urbanization during this period. The neo-Gothic Bel Air Apartments welcome visitors with its projecting Tudor arch stone entrance surmounted by an oriel and crenellated and pointed parapet. Interrupted by random schist blocks, the red and black brick front was detailed with a brick soldier course and standing brick window lintels. The terraced front maintains its historic ironwork. It was designed by Ethan J. Fieldstein, who later designed the Savoy apartment building in Rittenhouse Square, as well as residential and non-residential projects in and around the city. Built in 1937 as market-rate housing for middle-class households, the Bel Air was convenient to mass transit, as well as the shopping district a few blocks away. It seems to have been an early instance of an air-conditioned apartment building. Its owners, Stephen and Catherine Haas, lived in one of the apartments. A Hungarian immigrant, Stephen was a realtor who had employed Fieldstein on at least one other apartment building. His wife, Catherine, who had been born in Pennsylvania, was a well-known clubwoman. During the Second World War, she was the president of the National Federation of Women's Clubs and devoted her time to promoting the sale of war bonds. After the war, she was recognized by Palestine for her relief work there. Most of the apartments at that time were occupied by middle-class couples, several of the men being engineers. Eventually, the commercial hub along narrow Germantown Avenue spilled over onto wider Shelton Avenue, which saw incremental development. One of the earliest businesses to do so was George Allen Incorporated, a small but successful retailer in Center City. This occurred thanks to the leadership of President Thomas J. Sinclair at a time when the other big six department stores remained downtown. Allen's was a hub for mid-priced goods at this Germantown location for 4 decades. It was designed by architect and engineer Clarence Edmund Wunder, a Philadelphian and graduate of the Central Manual Training School, who was responsible for the Bonwit Teller department store at 17th and Chestnut, as well as the Pennsylvania Hotel. The contractor, the Turner Construction Company, was renowned for pioneering concrete construction techniques at that time and built this project in 1927. The result was a 3-story steel frame building clad in Indiana limestone above granite and tapestry brick. Called at the time lavish but sleek, the Art Deco department store had a chamfered corner to acknowledge the corner site. Parapets accentuated the main entrances below, which had tall coffered barrel vaults and were paved with multicolored slate tile. Show windows that helped to fuel shoppers' aspirations had geometric metal trim with transoms, now lost. The top was crowned by a continuous band of decorative carved panels with organic motifs. Recently, the building has housed a charter school and small retailers and has been undergoing renovations. This next example is truly a hidden gem, since the student uncovered what might survive behind later layers. Built as an auto showroom for Clarence Brown in 1927, on a street then filled with auto showrooms, the architect was Carl Ziegler, a native Philadelphian with an architecture proficiency certificate from the University of Pennsylvania, as well as studies at both the Spring Garden Institute and the Museum and School of Industrial Art. Ziegler had earned a reputation as an expert in the colonial architecture of Pennsylvania, and he used that style in the design of several large suburban houses and a church just off Schoolhouse Lane. He also preserved colonial monuments such as Carpenter's Hall, Independence Hall, and Washington's headquarters at Valley Forge. On the other hand, for the auto showroom, Ziegler turned to Art Deco glamour with colossal fluted pilasters and low relief decorative panels in limestone framing a large glazed expanse. First floor plate glass show windows and small paned transoms were separated by marble spandrels from the second glazed story with its shallow balcony. Soon the building was converted into a Philadelphia gasworks office, and more recently was occupied by retail businesses, though currently it is vacant. With each change, the facade was increasingly covered or fabric possibly removed. Further investigation is needed to determine what remains. Founded by Alexander Graham Bell, the Bell Telephone Company and its associated labs were pioneers in communication technology. The growing business acquired the site gradually during the last years of the 19th century, so that by 1896, the smaller lots had been assembled. But the building history is quite complicated and is still unresolved. Due to limited information from building permits, we cling to a reference in the Philadelphia Real Estate Record and Builder's Guide from 1927 for a Germantown central office building. It indicates that John T. Windrum, the architect of many Bell buildings, was commissioned to design extensive alterations and a two-story addition to an existing building that may have resulted in the structure we see today. Brick and stone sheathing a steel frame with cement floors and hollow tile partitions. Fortunately, little change has occurred on the neo-federal exterior. The facade of brick and textured mortar was trimmed in marble and featured a complex composition. Graceful pilasters framed the lowest two stories of the central 5 bays, including the first story arched openings with blind lunettes. Above, stone bands aligned the 3rd and 4th story windows, which were separated by decorated brick spandrels. The 5th story windows, resting on a cornice, read like an attic below an austere parapet. Besides his work for Bell Telephone, Windrum was the architect of the Franklin Institute and other Center City landmarks. This address is now occupied by Verizon, but seems underused. Simultaneously hard to miss and probably often overlooked is the Barker Building, Germantown's first really tall structure. Erected to serve as offices for the Germantown Trust Company in 1929 to 30, it was designed by the Ballinger Company. That Philadelphia-based firm traced its roots back to the 1870s, but did not acquire the name Ballinger until 1920. By then, it was one of the largest commercial and industrial design firms in the country. Its oeuvre included the Victor Talking Machine Company building and Joseph M. Campbell Company building in Camden, the Commodore Theater in West Philadelphia, many hospitals, and by the 1940s had designed one of the first computer rooms for the University of Pennsylvania, along with other large projects throughout the region. The Barker Tower paid homage to the economic powerhouse that was the Germantown Avenue, Shelton Avenue commercial hub of the 1920s to 1940s. The tripartite tower was articulated mainly in the neo-Gothic style. Its base was clad in limestone and granite and capped by a corbelled arch cornice. Above that rose a 9-story shaft of tan brick, trimmed with vertical bands of projecting bricks, and a limestone cornice of corbelled arches adorned with Gothic shields, decorated panels, and gargoyles, and at the corners, Art Deco eagles. Finally, the pinnacle featured setbacks with parapets decorated by many of the same motifs, as well as herringbone patterned brick. The side elevations were simplified versions of the facade. The design is a great example of the 1920s melding of traditional neo-Gothic motifs with contemporary Art Deco sensibility. Over its long history, the building has witnessed massive social and economic changes in the neighborhood. In the 1970s, its historic occupants were supplanted by others, including the Black Affairs Council, and thereafter was converted into affordable housing for seniors and renamed Interfaith House. Today, it still towers over the diverse neighborhood of stable residential side streets and neglected commercial thoroughfares. Finally, as I look at potential sites for future research, I only have to go down the block from these two last buildings. I could call this one the one that got away, because no student has chosen this building as their subject yet. It was the Franklin Simon department store. In the 1950s, Franklin Simon was one of New York's largest department stores. They had satellite stores in other cities, including Trenton, Atlanta, and Center City, Philadelphia. It was part of the city stores conglomerate, along with Litt Brothers on East Market Street. Franklin Simon already occupied this Germantown address in 1953, with photos revealing a women's clothing store with a stylish modern flair. However, until city archives and other repositories reopen, more detailed information will have to wait. I have two major conclusions regarding this multi-year endeavor. The first conclusion is about the built environment of these two neighborhoods. The first or dominant impression of each neighborhood seems coherent, and often the same people or organizations are connected to multiple sites. Nevertheless, at closer inspection, it's clear that the architecture is quite diverse. There are older structures and newer ones, and many different building types. Some were designed by architect builders of purely local significance, and others designed by firms with monumental projects across the country. A few structures retained their original programs and historical appearance, but others have been altered physically and or adapted to new uses. Such stories confirm my own experience in researching the summer estates along Schoolhouse Lane, that even modest structures like carriage houses or gate lodges can reveal interesting, even significant histories. The second conclusion deals with the method of uncovering our collective past. A city as historically rich as Philadelphia provides lots of opportunities for students and amateur historians to explore. Many hidden gems are still out there waiting to be documented and interpreted for our time and for future generations. And students typically bring a focus to this work that surpasses their efforts on remote sites with no community connection or on other topics done in a vacuum. So look out, Roxborough, Mount Airy, and maybe Nicetown and North Philly. We may be coming your way soon. Thanks for your attention. Thanks to all the students who did the vast majority of this research. And I encourage all of us to pay closer attention to the buildings we encounter every day. Thank you.
David, can you hear me?
I can.
And I want to thank you for your very informative and utterly fascinating lecture. I know you will be happy to answer some questions from our audience. So you might be ready.
I would. So I know some people may have already entered, or people are invited to enter questions into the chat box, or feel free to unmute yourself and speak up.
Well, I just loved the presentation, Dr. Breiner. It was really good to see it again.
Thank you. That's one of the.
Yeah, I got to see the new stuff that I hadn't seen in the beginning, and then I saw all the stuff from our class. I was like, oh.
Sarah Meyer is the student who did the research on those twin Second Empire style houses on Shelton Avenue and did a fabulous job tracking down every owner and occupant of those two buildings, as well as doing the most thorough conditions survey that I have seen on a building of that type. So I'm glad that you enjoyed watching what your classmates had done, and obviously what students had done in other semesters when you weren't around. So this is really the product of your work. So thank you.
Great job.
Thank you.
Oh, David, I have a question.
Okay.
It was a great presentation.
Hi, Suzanne.
I
Thank
love
you.
that you actually were able to showcase our students because they're so great. What was the biggest hurdle that you had in this kind of work? And it's very sophisticated for students.
It is, and it's a challenge because, of course, I don't want to fully research a building before I assign it to a student, because I'd spend a lot of time doing that. So as I mentioned, on Shelton Avenue, for example, I chose several other buildings, some of which turned out to not be very well documented or have such contradictory documentary information that it was maybe too complex for the amount of time and experience that the students had. So it's a little bit of a risk, just looking at buildings and saying, this one looks like it might be pretty good, this one looks like it might be pretty good, and then after 7 or 8 weeks realizing that some of them turn out to be great successes and some of them turn out to be a little bit of a struggle.
So every single time is a new adventure, kind of.
Exactly.
With the student, yeah.
That's
Yeah,
right. And
thank
of
you.
course, with the pandemic, the big problem right now is we don't have access to building permits and many of the other documents that we would need to have in order to write an interesting and accurate history of these buildings.
Right. Thank you.
Sure.
Can I say something? I want to say hello to
Yeah.
Sigrid Wilkie.
Is she
Hi.
here?
Yes, she is.
Oh, how terrific.
Yeah. And I haven't seen you for so long. This is a great time to see you. Hello, Sigrid, virtually. So thank you, David, for that too.
First of all, yes, you're very welcome. And for all my colleagues and friends from going back to college days, as well as my contemporary colleagues, I'm really glad that you are here seeing what students are doing these days. I know when I started teaching these courses, they were very different. I think we've all learned that students perform best when they're given a challenge and they feel like they're doing something that is valuable to the community. And so I'm really glad to be able to share that with people.
And the level of challenge that you present has really helped the graduate students to really become professionals.
I
Thank you
hope
for
that's
that
the
too.
goal. I hope it does.
Yeah, I think it does. Sure.
And it's wonderful to see a neighborhood that one knows so well and to look again at it in detail. I found it fascinating.
Oh, well, thank you, Sigrid. For those of you who don't know Sigrid, she is a wonderful colleague, a specialist in the Bauhaus, but a resident for many years of Northwest Philadelphia. And yes, of course, you do recognize some of these buildings.
Oh, yes.
And that was part of my goal, was to show things that some people would be familiar with, but hopefully a few things that would be new. And certainly some of the research was at least new to me. I don't know if other people feel like what they saw was actually just a repetition of what they already knew, but I hope not. I think the students have uncovered some interesting histories of buildings that are just so full of interesting stories.
I have a question for you.
Yes, Jean, hi.
How are you? It was a great offering. Thank you so
Oh,
much.
thank you.
And I understand what efforts the students have gone through, having done some of that myself for Roger Moss's class.
Mm-hmm.
The Philadelphia Historical Commission has often set surveys in the past. They have undertaken surveys independently on their own of certain Philadelphia neighborhoods. I know that's not being done anymore, but in your seeking out areas for students to respond to, have you noticed or interfaced at all with any surveys that the Historical Commission has perhaps started and not finished or anything like that?
I was aware of the fact that they had these things, but I have to admit that I never focused on them, although you actually bring up a terrific suggestion, which would be to pick up where they've left off. And the examples that I showed today, the East Falls and part of a very small part of Germantown, were chosen for the reasons that I explained and are of course very convenient for students. But sure, if there are half-done surveys of other places, what a great opportunity for students to learn about other neighborhoods in the city that they might not be as familiar with. So in the future, I will look into that, and I'm sure that the staff at HSP would be helpful in terms of giving me some guidance as to what might be some good options.
It's just that I have the sense that there's a lot unfulfilled that they've started, and I just know that that whole Spruce Street area had been surveyed once, and I don't think it's ever fully come to its fruition. But anyway, it's something to explore and might give you some ideas of places that have buildings of great interest with need for further research.
That's a terrific suggestion. I'm writing it down now so I don't forget it.
Okay.
Thanks.
David, it's Bruce.
Hi, Bruce.
A great talk. It
Thanks.
was great to see buildings that I'd never seen before, and I thought that I knew. I thought that I knew that neighborhood, and I was probably most impressed by again the way you brought the students both into your research as well as giving them the shout out. And you know, it's been my pleasure to work with a number of them. My question as an archivist is what's happening to their product? So is it going into the library or archives at Thomas Jefferson? And if not, I'm going to wave my hand and say, even well, whether it's the best research or whether it's the not quite so best research, some research is better than no research. And just like what Jean was just talking about, for future students and scholars to build upon what somebody else has learned is very effective. So, as somebody, one of the things that Roger did, and we have records from Jean, is that he had the students, actually place their papers at the Athenaeum.
That's a terrific suggestion. In fact, some of these rise to the level of even being adequate to go to the Historical Commission for possible designation or putting nomination to the register. But you're right, they do vary in quality, which is perfectly understandable. And it's not even that it's not always the strongest students that do the best job. Sometimes a student just winds up with a project that turns out to have a lot of good information available. But I would be glad to make these available to some repositories such as the Athenaeum, because after all, then people would be able to profit from it more than just my enjoyment of reading these at the end of the
Right.
semester.
Well, it's a question of, you know, what happened, you know, what happens to them down the line, because it's good work, and almost impossible to duplicate. So, and the other I actually sent you an email right in the middle of your lecture, which I hope you didn't read yet. But
No, I haven't.
for the John B. Kelly House, the Athenaeum has 36 drawings of interior design plans for that house by an interior decorator from the 1920s and 30s whose name was Oscar Mertz. So if ever you get the interior design students at TJU involved, there's some original documentation for there as well. Could be a whole other semester. There's at least 36 sheets just for the Kelly House.
It's funny that you should bring that up because I don't know, is Kevin King in on this call today? He may not be available.
I joined very
Kevin.
late because I had to work late. So
Okay.
I'm glad to see the little record button in the top corner.
You'll be
I'm gonna
able
have
to
watch it again.
Right, you'll be able to do that. But I mention you because do you recall when we first started that project, we saw something on PAB that said that there were interior drawings, and then a week or two later when we went back to track them down, we couldn't find it again.
Yeah,
and I think there was so much other material available that we kind of just let it drop.
There's one drawing that's digitized on PAB, but there's 36 drawings in the folder, and so it may be worth a trip when we reopen.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah. But that was quite a fun project.
Good.
So.
And again, this is the sort of the layered approach. Is that you know one semester finds this, and the next semester finds that. A whole different discipline finds other pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah, I haven't recently had any interior design students in these courses, but they're welcome to take them. And frankly, though, I think architecture and historic preservation students would be similarly interested in that as well. So yeah, we definitely should track that down. See if there are any other questions coming in.
I have a question, but it's based on the knowledge of the class. Was Dan's the house that was like randomly in the middle of a parking lot? Was that just inconclusive?
Yeah, Sarah is referring to a building that I decided not to include because it was so full of contradictions that we didn't have, even though Dan worked so hard and came up with so many wild theories about why this building wasn't documented in a clear way. I just thought it would take over the whole presentation and nobody would pay attention to anything else. But it's a building that seems to, it's pushed back from Shelton Avenue. It's faced in stone, and it was apparently a gymnasium for the director of whatever SEPTA was called before it was renamed SEPTA. And unfortunately, even the chain of title was completely messed up. It led through East Shelton Avenue, and there were names on there that didn't connect, and it's going to actually take a lot of effort to untangle that. So that could be a whole talk in itself, Sarah, because the building was so full of contradictions. It shows up on atlases and then it disappears on the next atlas and then it shows up again on a later atlas. Dan came up with the idea that there was something nefarious about the building, and that's why the documents never made a lot of sense. So.
I just wanted to say, I do have an early ad of that building showing like that it was like a gymnasium. I can't remember exactly what the name of it was, but I could send it to you if you're interested.
Oscar, the student Dan who worked on it and I would love to find out whatever you have about it, and we'd be happy to share whatever we've found out about it.
It actually has like a photo of the building if I'm remembering it correctly. I'll have to find it. I know I sent it to Connie Winters, who owns the building.
Oh, actually, you know what? She shared it with us already. It's kind of a partial view of the street looking down from. This
is like an ad that says like exactly what the building was.
Oh, okay. That's
might have
different.
mentioned like what they did there. I can't remember.
Okay, well,
quite aligning with the SEPTA thing. I'll just send it to you. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I was surprised when I saw it because all the stories I'd heard about it were a little bit contradictory. So,
Oscar, I'm not surprised that you would have some information on it. That's great. We had one historic photo that was taken from the street looking between two buildings at the front of the site down towards it. And that was the only photographic evidence that he was able to find on it. So yeah, whatever you have would be possibly a key into unlocking its history.
Yeah, I didn't research it at all, but I'll find it and send it to you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, you might have said this, what made you decide to do Shelton Avenue?
Well, it was at the same time, one of the groups of landscape architecture students was working on the Ed Bacon competition. And we thought, it's right in our backyard. Why don't we have students researching the history of the local buildings, which could inform the designers as they worked on their landscape urban design? And I think it turned out that it took so long to actually document the buildings that it was probably too late for them to actually decide which of those buildings was worth saving and how could they influence the design. But now I know in retrospect, or what I should do in the future is, do that research first before the design students make any decisions, so that it can be the information would be available to them when it matters. So.
Okay. What else I have?
Well, David, I think that's all the questions we have. And I want to thank you again for a great lecture and a great service you've made to Save Our Site. So.
Well, thank you, David. And may I just say that I'm looking in the chat box and I see, for example, Joseph Minardi was the source of that photo. Thank you very much. Although I neglected to say it earlier because I couldn't figure out where it was from. That's okay. I appreciate that, Joseph. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And yes, we should try to disseminate this information more. And I hope I will have access to all of this information in the chat so I can follow up on it. So hopefully David S. will be able to provide that to me. Because I'm not sophisticated enough to know how to save what's in the chat. Oh, there we go, save chat. Okay, I think I did.
Yes, but he's kind of behind the scenes here. That's David Safa, who I want to credit for the amazing task he's accomplished putting this Zoom event together. Okay, David Safa, where are you?
It's my pleasure, David.
Thanks, we couldn't have done this without you.
Absolutely. Just in response to what Oscar said about why is Shelton Avenue important and Germantown Avenue. Well, I come from Louisville, Kentucky. I came in 1964. Louisville, of course, is a much smaller city than Philadelphia. And at that time, I went up to Germantown Avenue and Shelton Avenue. And what I saw was another downtown. It could have been to the downtown of Louisville. There was a department store, a high rise. Even though it was in decline at that point, it really was a bustling center, another downtown in Philadelphia. It was utterly astonishing. So anyway, in conclusion, I have a few announcements. I want you all to know that the people who were unable to attend tonight and those who would like to hear the lecture again will be able to do so on YouTube in forthcoming weeks and months. We have recorded this lecture and will announce to you when it will be available on YouTube.
Nice.
Next year, Save Our Sites has 2 lectures planned, one by Joseph Minardi, who we just saw. Joseph Minardi's new book, Philadelphia City of Neighborhoods, has just been published, and he will speak about the publication and sign books, of course. As well, Professor Michael Lewis of Williams College, whose book, a gathering of his writings over the many years, will be published later in 2021, will speak. That'll probably be toward the end of the winter, early spring. In June, we hope to have our annual walking tour, expecting that by then it will be safe to stroll about outside all together. In the meantime, we wish you all a joyous holiday season, and thanks again for attending this event. Good night, everyone.
Good
Good night and thank you.
David and David.
Thank you.
Take
Good
care.
night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good night.
Okay.